All right, so let's look at the mechanics of all this in more detail. So we're going to start with experiments. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define all the variables that we typically see in experiments, because you really cannot understand what an experiment is, a true experiment and a quasi-experiment, until you understand the variables. So one important variable in an experiment, whether it's true or quasi, is the independent variable. Now, hopefully, this is not new. You should have learned about independent and dependent variables in Psych 1010. Perhaps you learned about independent and dependent variables in high school, maybe even in middle school. But the thing is that I have found over the years that this is one of the more difficult concepts for people to get. That is, they have a hard time, they struggle with identifying an independent variable in an experiment and the dependent variable in an experiment. They get them confused all the time. So we are spending quite a bit of time on this, because if you don't correctly identify your variables, then it's very likely your statistics are going to be meaningless. So we have to make sure that you guys get this, okay? So the independent variable is the variable that you manipulate as the experimenter, and you're manipulating this variable because you want to know, does it affect something else, some other variable? Now, remember I said that manipulate has a very specific meaning. Manipulating means you are creating these different groups of the variable, these different categories. We call those different groups or categories, we call them levels of the independent variable. So if you're testing a drug and maybe you want to test placebo versus 1 pill, 2 pills, you see how the drug that I'm testing, I have to manipulate it by creating groups. Placebo, 1 pill, 2 pills. It's the independent variable because I think that this variable is going to impact something else. Don't worry, I'm going to give you lots of examples, all right? So let's start with those examples. Let's say I wake up in the morning and I want to know, I wonder if teaching method has an effect on, well, I don't know yet. But I think teaching method is going to affect something. Now, in order for me to study teaching method as my independent variable, remember it's independent because I think this is going to have an effect on some other behavior. In order for me to test that, I have to create groups or levels. And so what might I do, right? How am I going to manipulate this? Well, one way of doing it is I might compare these two groups. Online teaching versus face-to-face. Is one method better than the other method? Right? You will always have groups. If you have an independent variable, you will always have groups to test it. So online, face-to-face, here are 2 groups. Those are the levels of teaching method. Now, an independent variable must always have at least 2 groups, 2 levels. It can have more, but it can't just have one. You can't establish what effect does teaching method have if you only test one method. You have to have at least 2. Here's another one. Does type of test affect something else? All right, now this is the independent variable because I think that the type of test I give is going to have an impact on something. All right, now I'm not telling you what that something is, but right now I want you to focus on the independent variable. So if I think this is going to influence something else, then this is my independent variable. And remember, what do we have to do next? Create levels. So what might be the levels? Well, how about an open test, right? Open book exam versus a closed book exam, right? Those are going to be my two levels, my two groups, right? Now, this is one thing that you should avoid doing. If, let's say, I were to give you these two levels, and I were to ask you, what is the independent variable? Here are the levels. What is the independent variable called? Don't just say the independent variable is open and closed book. Because what you're doing is you're not telling me the name of the independent variable. You're telling me the name of the levels. So you got to come up with a name that is more general, type of test. And then these are the names of the specific levels. Oh, I guess my slide is telling me to move on. All right, here's another example. Does a teacher's sex, male or female, affect something else? Right? So teacher's sex, that's the name for the independent variable. It's independent because I think that this variable is going to have an effect on something. So it's my independent variable. And then male and female would be my specific levels. So here's how I'm manipulating teacher sex. Now you might say, wait a second, how do you manipulate sex? All right, because it's not like you can snip and say, okay, you're male, you're female. Well, manipulate doesn't always mean that I create a man, I create a woman. I mean, it's not like that. Manipulate in this sense just means that I decided that I am going to study, teacher sex by studying genetic, XXXY. So it's because I decided on what my levels will be that counts as a manipulation. All right, one more. Does vape juice flavor affect? Now, vape juice, we're talking about the e-cigarettes. And just to give you a little bit of background here, e-cigarettes, for those of you who don't know, when you puff on them, they create this vapor. All right, it looks like smoke, but it's not smoke. It's vapor. They're particulates in the air, but no smoke. Now, there's lots of concerns about whether e-cigarettes are safe, etc. But one concern that people have is that depending on the flavor, somebody might vape more because they're vaping because they enjoy the flavor so much. All right, so you may wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to run an experiment. I know I'm going to test the effect of vape juice flavor on something else. So because this is what you're going to manipulate, you want to know because you think vape juice flavor is going to affect something. So this is your independent variable. Now you have to manipulate this variable. How are you going to do it? Well, you might do this. You're going to create different levels. Remember, the groups or categories are referred to as levels. So here you have 3 levels: no flavor, fruit flavor, and a complex flavor. So a complex flavor would be something that is a combination of maybe different fruits. So this might be fruit flavor, might be lemon, whereas this is going to be Pina Colada Express or something like that. It's more complex. All right, so these are the 3 levels of your independent variable vape juice flavor. All right, so are you getting a sense of what an independent variable is then? The independent variable, if you're reading a hypothetical study, you might have an easier time identifying the independent variable by looking for the different groups that were tested. You know that those are the categories. Once you identify those different groups, those are the categories of your independent variable, the levels. And then you have to say, okay, so what was my independent variable? It's going to be a more general name, right, rather than the specific names given to the different levels. And remember, the independent variable is the one that you think, or the experimenter thinks, is going to have an effect on something else. So it's the variable that you think is going to cause something else to change. All right? So now it's time to talk about dependent variables. The dependent variable is the variable that is being affected by the independent variable, right? So it's the variable affected, it's being changed or influenced by the independent variable. Specifically, the different values of the dependent variable, all right, so whether you get a high score, low score, whatever, the specific values of the dependent variable will depend on which group or condition the participant was in. So it depends on which level of the independent variable the participant was in. And we're going to go through the same 4 scenarios. This time, we're going to identify the dependent variable in each. So remember that we, on the previous slide, we identified teaching method as the independent variable because we said we think this is going to have an effect on something. Well, that something is the DV. So here we're saying test scores are going to, whether they're high or low, they're going to depend on which teaching method the participant was in. Test scores might be high, for example, in face-to-face, and low in online. Hopefully not, because we're not face-to-face right now, but this is, just to help you understand why this is the dependent variable. We call it dependent because whether your score is high, medium, or low is going to depend on which teaching method group you were exposed to, which level. Let's go through the other examples. All right. Sorry, I forgot that this line was going to pop up, but you want to see if test scores differ between online and face-to-face. So you're saying test scores depend on which of these groups you're in. Okay. How about this one? Does type of test affect test anxiety? So remember, type of test was the independent variable because we thought, well, it's going to affect something. What is it that we think it's going to affect? Well, what about test anxiety? We can say that's, a dependent variable. Could be many things, right? We could say test scores as well. We could say it affects, maybe retention rates or, I don't know, stress or whatever. But we chose test anxiety here, all right? What we're saying is this is a dependent variable because anxiety scores will depend on whether you're in the open book condition or the closed book condition. What about this? Does a teacher's sex affect, and then student evaluations? Student evaluations is the dependent variable. Teacher sex is what we thought would affect something else, right? So this is the cause. What do we think it's going to affect? Student evals. Okay, so then this is the dependent variable. Why? Because we're saying that the dependent variable, evaluation scores, will depend or differ between whether you were in the male teacher group or the female teacher group. And finally, does vape juice flavor affect daily puffs? Okay, so that's your daily puffs is your dependent variable. Vape juice flavor was the independent because we said, well, we think this is going to have an effect on something else. What that something else is your dependent variable. And so we're expecting to see that the number of daily puffs is going to differ. That means it's going to depend on whether you were in the no flavor group, the fruit flavored group, or the complex flavor group. All right? So we have covered independent variables. Those are the variables that we manipulate. Those are the variables that we create the different levels, different groups of. We manipulate that variable. So we're creating different levels. And then we think that independent variable is going to have an effect on something else. The something else is your dependent variable. It's called dependent because it depends how you score on the dependent variable depends on which group of the independent variable you were in.